Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
This week on the podcast, we wanted to talk about imposter syndrome, which is a term that has gained currency in the culture. Lots of people can relate to that term. And we've been kicking it around a little bit this morning, and it's something that we have some experience with, both maybe personally, but also in terms of our clinical practice. It was a term that was first coined by two psychologists, Clance and Imes, two female psychologists in 1978. They wrote a paper called The Imposter Phenomenon. And they noticed it initially in these high-achieving women. And then the term kind of picked up steam a little bit in the culture and became referred to as imposter phenomenon. But I think it's worth pointing out that these two psychologists who originated the term weren't so comfortable with calling it a phenomenon because it makes it sound like it's something negative. Calling it a syndrome, because it makes it sound like it's something negative and also something permanent. So we are not sure that it's either. So we'll agree with the kind of framing of it being a phenomenon. And we're going to try to put it into a depth psychological lens today.
And before we jump in to the imposter syndrome, I just wanted to remind everybody that we have a Patreon funding page that you can access through our website, thisjungianlife.com. And when you go to Patreon, and if you choose to support us, it allows us to do a number of essential things. It allows us to stay free of corporate sponsorship. And in these days, that is an extraordinary freedom, that we have no limits to the topics that we discuss and no editorial constraints. Your funding allows us to be free and unreserved in how we talk to you and how we talk among ourselves around these significant topics. So we hope that you'll continue your funding and also take a moment to perhaps contribute a little bit or a little bit more so that we can keep this Jungian life up and running. Thanks. So, imposter syndrome.
You know, I have a feeling that as we were discussing, this is just part of being human. You know, that all of us at times feel like we're inadequate, you know, not really on our game, not quite measuring up. You know, that expression in the culture of fake it till you make it, you know, that we put our game face on, so to speak, and, you know, charge into the fray to do what we have to do, even when we're feeling a little shaky inside. So, you know, I think it's a pretty universal feeling. And then it can get to be a pretty constant or undergirding feeling for a lot of people. And I think that's what we mean by imposter syndrome, when it's kind of a constant.
Well, I think, as you said, any of us can find ourselves in a circumstance where we don't feel like we know as much as we think we should know.
Exactly.
And in some ways, this is relevant to Jung and his ideas, because our ego is situated on an inner landscape, and it is in dialogue with various inner figures and internal structures. Sometimes on that inner landscape, we have idealized figures figures that seem supernaturally wise. And perhaps we've even projected these onto our professors, onto our parents, onto our coworkers, particularly if we're in an industry that we've longed to take part in. You've been in medical school and you're looking at the heads of the departments and they seem just so extraordinary. These are also internal projections that we've carried, archetypes of the wise one, the artisan, any number of those really extraordinarily skilled archetypal forces. And when the ego compares itself to any of these figures, it finds itself lacking, nervous, unsure, dishonest, and less than. Although people who are actually evaluating our work might say, you look great. You're doing exactly what we hoped you would do. But there's this dance between the ego and these other figures inside of us that seems to interrupt our confidence.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Joseph. I think that's really just brilliant, that the kind of bring in the archetypal part here, because I had a very similar thought. It's very common among doctors, imposter syndrome, apparently, if you just do a little bit of research, very common among doctors. And I thought, oh, of course, because to become a physician, you have to be willing to carry the projection of healer. To step into your authority in any field, you have to be willing to carry the projection of expert or wise old man or wise old woman. And that it's a big burden. It's a big burden to carry a projection. And it is actually necessary in some instances, like, for example, when we're an expert, when we're a CEO, when we're, a film star, when we're a doctor, that we are clothing ourselves with a kind of archetypal cape. And you're right, the tension between, what our ego knows and the energies that we're kind of calling down, that can be kind of crushing. The interesting thing is that the alternative to feeling like an imposter is to become identified with these archetypal energies. And then you're dealing with inflation, which is dangerous in its own way. So in some sense, Deb, I agree with you. Maybe this is just part of being human. And it could be that if it's held correctly, it's more adaptive to doubt yourself than to identify with the archetypal projection and think, well, yeah, I'm a great healer.
It's a really interesting tension that we're lifting up here, as if the choices are, to really try to measure up to some sort of archetypal ideal, which is impossible, and as a consequence, feel less than or inadequate. Versus sort of, shrink back because we can't make it, of where is that place where we can carry the projection, if that is what is expected or needed. If that is what people put on us, then so be it, but not identify with it and simply accept our own humanity, that I am a person doing my very best in whatever field of leadership or knowledge or expertise is required of me. I get the projection. I'm aware that I'm only human. I do my best. And therefore, that imposter syndrome would recede.
I think that there can also be a similar kind of tension between the conscious personality and the intimation of who we're meant to be and the destiny that we're carrying. So I know, for example, I worked with a young woman who was very talented and very capable and had a lot of great capabilities. And she felt so small and so incompetent. And I could really see, we kind of named this as this imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. But I think that she was experiencing this kind of crushing discrepancy between who she was in the moment, which is a young woman who had not yet finished college, and the kernel of her own destiny, which is sort of born by our daimon, or carried forward, unfolded by the self, in another way of thinking about it. And that awareness of that discrepancy, to feel, for example, that you have the potential or maybe even the calling to become, let's say, an artist, but to feel so inadequate in terms of your development, that can engender a feeling of imposter syndrome as well.
I'm thinking about, these ideals, the archetypal ideal of what I should know to be perfect. And if we're measuring ourselves against an external standard, what does it take to get ourselves, like this, for this young woman to say, I'm enough. I can be an artist today and next week, and in 10 years I'll be, no doubt more of an artist because we learn and grow. But that place of self-acceptance, that who I am today is okay, and I'm not measuring myself against some sort of ideal of perfection or stellar kinds of qualities. And what does it take to get to that place of who I am and how I am is adequate? It's good enough. And I think it's an internal measure of, I love to do art. I love to draw or paint or whatever it is. And that's what I bring to it, is myself, rather than what other people will deem worthy.
Well, but I think that imposter syndrome is inherently between the individual and the environment, instead of, as you'll often say, Deb,
Absolutely.
between myself and myself.
Yes.
So while somebody might feel a great love of making art alone and for themselves and as an expression of an inner image, as soon as that art is subject to other people's scrutiny, then it sets off a whole other imaginal process in the artist or in the physician or in the psychoanalyst, for that matter.
Yeah.
And it has so much to do with, historically, how we've been given feedback, our sense of ourselves, and whether or not I think our identity is clear and known to ourselves. And I think actually our capacities as well. So when I think about the many different ways in which parents, for instance, communicate their expectations to children, because we do want our kids to achieve a potential, we do want to give them an accurate feedback process. We hope that the institutions, the schools and training that they receive actually provide information for them to know how well or not they're doing. That can become internalized and also move into a kind of alliance with our survival dynamics. So, for instance, if we have a kid that doesn't do well on a math test and they're horrified to come home and have a parent see that they got a D on the test, and that the consequences for the child feel catastrophic, that will inherently ignite several defenses in the child. One is the trickster. How can we hide a lack of competency to avoid an ego annihilating reaction? Now, that might happen just by making your report card disappear miraculously, and I've had plenty of friends do that, or meticulously erasing and carefully pixelating, the D into a B, on the report card. Many stories of
Joseph,
that.
do you have experience with this?
I was too terrified of my parents to get caught doing that. But there was much dialogue about how we might handle that. But when we feel like the environment is putting us at risk because of our struggle to achieve and grow, then we do have to, in a sense, become imposters. We do have to shroud ourselves. We have to pretend that we have more than we may feel like we have, just in order to be safe. Now, we might outgrow that situation and find that in college we're amazing. We understand everything. We're kind of acing all the tests, but we can still have that child inside that fears that if somebody were to look deeply enough, they would find out that we're just skating the surface, that we're just making shit up and hoping that nobody sees it so that we can get the grade, get the position. So I think family expectations can really influence this to some degree.
So I wonder if you're talking about shame of the kid who would be, to use your example, who'd be shamed to bring home a bad grade on a test or a report card, an internalized sense of inadequacy that then gets carried over to how others in the external world evaluate him or her.
Well, could be shame, although I think if we listen to some of our clients, it wasn't just shame that happened to them if they disappointed their parents. Sometimes it was more frightening than that. But a good talking to or being embarrassed definitely can create a sense that one wants to hide or misrepresent one's growing edge.
You've both been talking about, as you said, this negotiation between the person and the outer world. But I want to go back for a second to a different version. And perhaps, I think this is really interesting where we are right now, because I think we're perhaps describing kind of different kinds of imposter syndrome, if we're going to use that word, or imposter phenomenon, based upon maybe a different etiology. Because I can absolutely see what you're describing, Joseph, and I've seen that in my clinical practice. And I also want to see if I can kind of go back and elucidate a little bit further this idea about a discrepancy between who we experience ourselves now and who we know on a deep level we might become. And how that discrepancy can bring up feelings of inadequacy and imposter. And so maybe I'll just offer a couple of personal examples. So I remember when I was working for the relief agency in Croatia, we had this evening wherein some fairly high-ranking officials from a UN agency came into town, and myself and a colleague took them out to dinner. And I was a little bit in awe of this person because he was sort of a mucky muck. And I probably had like one too many glasses of wine at that dinner, and my tongue got a little loose, and I was talking to him. I don't even remember about what, but I was talking to him something about the situation or something. And I was sort of in the moment could feel myself becoming more and more ashamed that I'd said so much and allowed myself to kind of engage this person sort of as an equal. And by the end of the evening, I just felt like I was, a slime mold on the bottom of somebody's shoe. And I remember kind of talking with my colleague, and I was like, oh my God, I'm just so ashamed. She's like, why? You were amazing. And he really enjoyed talking to you. And I just couldn't even take that in. And another maybe more pointed example is when I applied for analytic training, so I had to go through a whole process here in Philadelphia with the Philadelphia seminar, and then the final interview was out in Boulder, and I got to the Denver airport, probably like my flight landed at like 11 o'clock at night, and then I had to take the shuttle to Boulder. And I still remember the hotel. The shuttle drops me off. It's late at night. I go in and I see signs for, the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. And my stomach just dropped. I was like, what am I doing here? Who do I think I am?
Oh.
And I just thought, if I had been able to just turn around and leave at that moment, I think I would have. I was like, I have made a huge mistake. I don't belong here. And, and I think that that's a form of imposter syndrome. Where there's this like rub between like, who I am in the moment and my inborn sense of destiny that, maybe I could do this, but I feel so kind of, I feel such deep humility as I approach this, and I'm not sure I'm up to the task. There's a couple of fairy tale motifs that I think are relevant here. First of all, the issue with imposter syndrome, I think, is not that we feel it, but that it stops us from doing something. So it's sort of like when you feel it, acknowledge it, and then keep going.
Yeah.
And this brings to mind all of these fairy tales. A motif in fairy tales is sort of the unlikely hero. So I'm thinking of the fairy tale, The Little Tailor, who is sewing away and he kills 7 flies with one swat. And he's so proud of himself, he makes himself a sign that says, I killed 7 at one blow. And he later winds up in a contest with a giant, So he's just a lowly tailor. But he, in sort of David and Goliath fashion, is willing to put himself forward in spite of the fact that he seems to be very humble. The other motif that comes up for me is the motif that I would call the humble gift. So the best known one is the little drummer boy that we know from the Christmas special. But it's like, as you approach the Holy of Holies, what do you have to offer? The little drummer boy just had his drumming ability. But of course, that was received by the Christ child. So as we approach our destiny, we may feel like we have very little to offer. But if we move toward it and sort of with an open heart and with good faith, we often find that our gifts are received, and then we can, over time, internalize our achievements to the point where this doesn't hold us back as much.
I'm thinking about my experience when I had gotten through School of Social Work, and I'm on my internship, and I'm about to meet my first client. And all I could think about was, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't know what I can offer any of these people. I don't know how to do this. And, there was a certain sense of, I think the standard of perfection or an ideal is that somehow I will be able to, create the miracle of healing or some such thing. But what I did that is akin to your image of the little drummer boy is I had an internal image of, that I would be serving food. And I wish I was Julia Child. I wish I could make, gourmet French cooking, and this client who comes in, I could serve the most fabulous food. And I thought, but you know what I do have to offer? A sandwich.
Yeah.
I have the ingredients for a ham and cheese sandwich. a pickle, some chips.
And you're going to serve the best sandwich you can serve.
That's right. And that is what I have to offer. And it is lifting up this motif that I think, you were onto, Lisa, of the humility, of that I will do my best, not against some elevated standard, but I will do my best to be here and to be present and to offer what I have to offer. And what's astonishing, of course, is that is enough. And ultimately, that's all we really do have is what we have. But I'm also thinking about what does it take to get to that point of that in some basic sense, I'm okay.
Right, because to restate what I said before, this isn't a problem when you feel it. It's a problem when it stops you from doing things.
Exactly. But what I'm thinking about along the fairy tale motif, our modern American fairy tale of the Wizard of Oz. And the wizard, with all his sound and light and the great Oz and the magical kingdom of Oz, actually is an imposter.
Right.
And then Dorothy's sidekicks, the Scarecrow and the Tin Man. The Scarecrow doesn't have a brain, but of course he actually does have a brain.
Yeah,
and the Tin Man doesn't have
smartest.
a heart, but he's very empathic and loving. But they are great examples of imposter syndrome where you really do have the right stuff. But they didn't know it until the end after going through all the trials and travails. And the Tin Man is presented with a heart, and the Scarecrow gets a diploma signifying his brain. That what does it take to get to that point of that you had it all along?
Yeah. Yes,
but you didn't know it.
You had it all along.
And I think that brings us back to the original meaning, I think, of the imposter syndrome, that they were studying people that really had been recognized for their professional excellence. They had displayed the academic achievement, whether it's through degrees or standardized testing or through attaining a particular position in an organization. So these are not people who were just starting out and wondering, at their first session if they had been trained adequately, but consistently had demonstrated expertise over and over again. And I think that goes to the Wizard of Oz analogy, Deb, really nicely. That despite the demonstration of courage, the demonstration of wisdom, the demonstration of love in the three characters, they lacked an internal acknowledgement of their accomplishments.
Yes.
And that's where, the Wizard of Oz has a kind of uncanny trickster wisdom, that the acknowledgement and the skill needed a bridging symbol.
Ooh, that's great. That's
and
great.
So the ticking heart clock is the symbol that bridges the true demonstration of love with the internal acknowledgement that the diploma or testimonial bridges the Scarecrow's actual knowledge with their capacity to acknowledge it. And there is something about that, and maybe that's why we do have graduation ceremonies and diplomas and other ways to link the worlds together.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
I like that a lot. That and that's straight out of Jung, isn't it? That only the symbol heals. And also, I think with the Wizard of Oz, or the diploma, that you've gone through some number of years of study. You've done the work. The characters in the Wizard of Oz go down the yellow brick road and go through all the adventures that they have. So that there is some kind of a process that the ego engages in to meet the world. Lisa, obviously you went through the interviews at Interregional, and I met my first clients. And so it goes with all of us, is that we do the thing. And then the symbol appears and has meaning. You can't award a diploma to somebody who's a freshman.
Mm-hmm.
There is some way that ego does its part. And then, as you said, Joseph, that bridging symbol appears and has meaning.
Yeah, Joseph, I love that phrase.
Yeah.
Links the worlds, which is really great. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I was doing my prep for this episode, came across this concept that people with imposter syndrome have not been able to internalize their achievements, which I think is kind of a great way to think about it. And like you're saying, symbols can help us do that. And also it's a ritual, right? When we have graduation ceremonies, that's a ritual. Even in the Wizard of Oz, this is kind of a ceremony where they each get their tokens, So the way that kind of speaks to the unconscious, a ritual, and can help us kind of break through that barrier to internalize our achievements. And of course, it's interesting to think about what keeps us from internalizing achievements. We could have a long conversation about that. That could be a lot of sort of nurture stuff, family of origin issues. But I do want to say that, there is a negativity bias, right? The human brain is kind of wired to pay more attention to negativity. So friends I have who are in the theater, they're very careful about reading negative reviews, because you could read 5 positive reviews and 1 negative one, and your brain's going to kind of simmer around the negative one. So you have to sometimes take action to combat that. And I remember years ago, someone gave me some advice that I practiced for a little while. The person said, get yourself a notebook, and in it, write down every positive thing that someone says to you. So when someone says, wow, that was a really great job. I really enjoyed, that presentation that you gave, write that down. When a client says, thank you so much, you've really helped me, write that down. So that you're kind of curating the positive feedback, not superficial feedback. I mean, this is different than garnering likes on a social media post, but really heartfelt, substantive, nice things that people say, compliments that people give you, or positive feedback, so that you're kind of compensating for the brain's natural proclivity to focus on the negative. And I do think that can be helpful in internalizing achievements. You can sort of go back to it and say, well, yes, there's this. I may not be perfect, but there's this. Look at this list I have.
Yeah.
Whether you actually do that or you sort of metaphorically do that.
I think there's a huge value to doing something like that, and basically just using one's own cognition, one's own frontal cortex, to acquire data, objective real world data, and that then we can think about how we think. Of like, oh, gee whiz, I'm not feeling confident. I'm feeling inadequate. I feel like an imposter on this job. And, well, look at my notebook where I have, 23 positive comments from people in the past week. So that helps us, just from an ego perspective, take a more objective stance, step back, go, oh my gosh, there's a mismatch between how I'm feeling, which is not okay, and what people are actually telling me, which is positive. And that can be a step along the path, like the Tin Man or the Scarecrow, to internalizing, maybe I really do have a brain and I do have a heart.
The sequel to the story about my arrival for that interview is that I did get in. And then after I heard
Yes,
that I
you
got
did.
in, after I heard that I got in, I became convinced that that was a mistake. And that they had told me that I was in error. And it wasn't until they asked me to take out my checkbook and write them a check that I thought maybe I really got in.
Oh, that's really funny. But I remember that too. The ritual of the checkbook comes right up, and then
Yeah.
you know for sure it's real. Once it turns into a monetary transaction.
Right. Then we're suddenly in a different world.
I'd like to bring up another complicated dimension of imposter syndrome that just really comes out of the research, which I'm still trying to sort through, that individuals with imposter syndrome often have feelings of guilt, which then show up as a fear of success. And some of the ways that the guilt shows up, but they don't necessarily go into why the guilt is there, which is one of the things that I think we can try to take hold of. When the guilt is under the imposter syndrome, it shows up like, I received a really good education, but other people didn't have that opportunity, and therefore I feel very guilty and an imposter. Being publicly acknowledged by others for the success can induce feelings of guilt, feeling that it's not right or fair to be in a better situation than a friend or a loved one, can evoke guilt. And then interestingly, the way one has been titled as a child, being the kid in the family who's always the smart one. Oh, you know, Lisa, she's the smart one, or the talented one, or the responsible one, or the sensitive one, or the good one, or the favorite. That being given a certain kind of exalted title in the family system creates a very complicated isolation from others. It may be rightly said, maybe one of the kids really does have an extraordinary talent. One of the kids really does have a higher IQ, but having that announced in the family system and the tension that creates in the family is then projected later in life onto the work situation and onto the adult social situation. That there's a cost that children bear for being singled out even for their gifts. So I'm curious about this idea of guilt that makes people feel like they must be an imposter.
Well, I think there really is something, and there's something in the reading that I did to bone up on this about wanting to feel special. And if that has been conferred upon you, you know, and I think all parents have a tendency to sort of assign roles or assign characteristics to kids. This one is the athletic one, and that one is the friendly, social one. She's always out having a good time. That we we those pats on the head from parents, from teachers, from our peers. And we tend to take in, you know, that, oh, this is my specialty. This is what I'm good at. Before we've really grown up enough to reflect and think about, wait a minute, you know, is this really right? And then I'm thinking about, you know, what you were talking about, Joseph, of guilt. And I'm wondering if some of it is related to survivor guilt. That I was pronounced the talented one, the good one, the special one, the whatever, I was the one that got to go to the special lessons, or just by luck of the draw, I got a scholarship to XYZ university, and maybe my siblings didn't.
I got out.
I got ahead, and did I really, quote, deserve, unquote, it? It's a little shaky there, the foundation of maybe I don't feel like I really earned it, especially if siblings or others from, one's hometown didn't have the same opportunities, weren't as lucky, didn't have the same resources. That knowing that we're all human, and then how do we reconcile ourselves with different qualities of privilege and different and inequities?
That's where I was going as we were talking, because the word privilege is just a firestorm word
It
in
sure
the culture
is.
right now. And it's a very complicated idea that to ask any number of people to assess the various privileges that they may have had access to and other people may have not, does it then mean that their achievements are invalid, that they are fraudulent because of benefits that they accrued because they could afford or could access a very high level of education? And I think that accusation, based on this research, will foster a greater sense of being an imposter, not deserving to exist in the realm of achievements that one has legitimately attained, because somehow it's been deemed illegitimate by virtue of the access, by virtue of the idea that only a small number of people were able to be afforded the opportunity.
Yeah.
It creates like a tremendous Gordian knot that there's doesn't feel like there's any way to escape that tension, at least in the culture at the moment, and seeing the cultural backlash against that as the shadow of the accusation of privilege makes people feel that they want to defend against being turned into an imposter by virtue of the privilege. It's an enormous, complicated dynamic on so many different levels.
You know what comes up for me about this? When I was thinking about this topic, the image that came to my mind was a cat's whiskers. Now, I might have this wrong. I don't pretend to be an expert on cat physiology, but I remember learning at one point, this may just be an old wives' tale, but I just want it for a metaphor, so bear with me if I get this wrong, that the cat's whiskers help it know what space it can go into or not, and that the whiskers are about as wide as the cat. So it seems like there is this problem that human beings have where we have to be able to assess ourselves somewhat realistically. If we overestimate our abilities, we could, sometimes that works really well for people, right? That can kind of go along with narcissism, and that can often actually engender a certain kind of success, but it also can get you into hot water. If you overestimate your abilities, you could wind up on the high wire with no net. If you underestimate your abilities, that comes with a different kind of peril. And I think obviously with imposter syndrome, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about kind of underestimating ourselves. The cat's whiskers apparently are exactly the right width to let the cat know I can go in this space and not get stuck. So we all need to kind of have our whiskers. If we're not able to kind of correctly assess ourselves, because, Joseph, of what you're talking about, that maybe the culture has encouraged us to disown ourselves from our accomplishments in a way. I'm going to go back to the Wizard of Oz, because one of the things that happens with Dorothy is that she really has, the first thing that happens is she lands in Oz, and everyone's like, "Oh my gosh, you're a really powerful witch." And she's like, "I'm not a witch. I'm just a good little girl from Kansas." But she is really powerful, and she hasn't been able to reconcile herself to that power. It physically exhibits itself by the ruby slippers. So it's, it's so brilliant, that film, because here she is, she's got pigtails, she's got this gingham dress, and then these ruby slippers that look very incongruous with this very kind of homespun look that she has. But really, it's a perfect metaphor for her psychological situation, because she is identified with the homespun. She thinks, I'm just a good little girl from Kansas. She can't claim her power that is symbolized by the ruby slippers. And so she keeps on, trying to give them away. The witch wants them. She's like, oh, here, take them, and it's only at the end, she's had them all along, but it's only at the end that she understands their power. But the thing is that when we disown ourselves from our abilities, we can become the object of others' envy, and also they can manipulate us, and they can take advantage of us, just like the witch kind of knows that Dorothy doesn't understand the power of the shoes, the Wicked Witch of the West. And she follows Dorothy all around Oz, trying to get the shoes off of her, because she thinks that, Dorothy's going to be an easy one to predate, as it were. And Deb, I know you were raising this earlier.
Yeah. You raise such an important point, that it does not serve anyone to underestimate who you are, what you have, and to be fully present for yourself in the world. Because other people, like the witch in the Wizard of Oz, recognize full well that Dorothy has the ruby slippers and has the power, and is out to get her.
Mm-hmm.
And other people get it and can manipulate and use and abuse you. And I'm remembering way back when, in the years that I was a special ed teacher, and wanting to be part of a team and wanting to do well and so on and so forth, I got assigned a lot of tasks that were extra by various people in the school system. And that work was used by others happily and to their great benefit.
And without credit.
I didn't know, and wasn't able to acknowledge that I was doing more, and that I really had worth, and that I did belong, et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite a task that we all have, of how not to overestimate posture, be inflated, arrogant, and domineering, and how not to underestimate and put ourselves down, or to be afraid to enter the fray. I loved your story, Lisa, about interviewing at Interregional, of it's scary as hell and I'm doing it anyway. So I wonder if what we're circling around, or at least I'm circling around, is do the work. Just do the work. Go to the interview. See those first clients. For Dorothy, just keep going down that yellow brick road. Feel the feelings, feel the fear, feel your inadequacy, and do it anyway. Just keep going and keep doing it, because somehow the experience of confronting the tests, the challenges, etc., have a tendency to accrue in the psyche. And then what you were talking about, Joseph, the symbol, the linking symbol will appear.
Another dimension that I think we're moving through is attribution style, which taps into the several things that each of you was speaking to. That if we do not have a correct attribution for our skills, that makes us feel that they are invalid. And this is a problem that particularly American culture, I think, needs to confront substantially. In our culture, and I've said this on a number of podcasts, we are so concerned with protecting and inflating the self-esteem of our children that we often do not attribute their successes to the factors that allowed that to happen. And then therefore, children are often left not knowing why they've achieved a certain status or even if they deserve it. So later on in life, when somebody is really talented and achieving well, those who suffer from imposter syndrome will often attribute it to luck and not to the fact that they attained 3 high-level degrees. Or they'll attribute it to the fact that they were able to get some people to like them and give them a shot, instead of the fact that they had 15 years of high-level experience. And particularly this trait where people will feel that they charmed themselves into a position will often have them leaving or left with this terrible feeling that they are going to be found out and that something awful and shameful is going to occur. So a wonderful thing that we can do for our children, but also do for ourselves, is to look at either our successes or failures, as you were saying, and correctly attribute them to our own action or lack of action. And this goes to the reality principle and to simply negotiating with reality. I've somehow, through nepotism, wound up in a position. I don't have the right training. I've never done it before. And I don't have a degree, and I'm flying by the seat of my pants. I might feel like an imposter, that this is a trickster situation, and the facts are suggesting that I either am going to find an incredible capacity to learn at lightning speed, to collaborate and get what needs to be done, even though it's brand new to me. I mean, that's one way I suppose we could find ourselves in a situation. But also to talk to ourselves accurately. This is why these things occurred. It's not crazy. It's not magical. It's not anyone giving us a favor. You know, we weren't like walking through the forest and tripped into a hole under a bunch of leaves and we found ourselves the CEO of a Fortune 500 company at the bottom of the pit. You know, you didn't trip into it. You know, you skillfully worked really hard and navigated very complicated situations. And it's up to us to narrate our own story accurately.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
I want to just
like
build on that for
lot.
1 second. I want to build on that for 1 second, just to bring back in the point that you made about guilt. Because if you didn't trip into being the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but you probably were lucky along the way too. And you worked hard, you had skills, you know, and the luck is in every situation, right? Sometimes we're lucky, sometimes we're unlucky. This belief that invalidates our success
Yes.
is not really rational.
Yes. There are those elements of chance. And I wonder about that, and I'm linking it with what you were talking about before, Joseph, around privilege. It's part of life. Some things fall our way, and some things don't. And then there is also the reality principle of, what you were talking about, Lisa, of a notebook. Write the data down. Step back for a second. Did I just trip into this? No, I worked hard and I have these educational experiences. I have this kind of work experience, this and that and the other, so that there is an objective assessment between what you actually have done and have learned and have experienced and can bring. And if there's a difference between that and how you feel, so be it. But there is a way to accurately or fairly accurately assess using the reality principle.
Jung said at one point that hard work propitiates the unconscious. And I think that's really brilliant because and it goes to the stuff that we're talking about, and specifically that you were bringing up, Joseph, is that if we feel like, we're just lucky, we just lucked into this, it's almost like the unconscious kind of works against us. But if we do the work, if we just do the work, then the unconscious kind of becomes our friend.
Exactly. And I think that's a theme that we have touched on in a number of ways in this conversation of just keep going and keep doing the work. It does propitiate the unconscious. I'm thinking about the flip side too for positive feedback, and that there's also seems to be a movement afoot that a couple of people have related of children being told that everybody gets an award, everybody gets a special thing. There are graduations now for graduating from 5th grade and graduating from 8th grade and so on. That I wonder if it feels to kids like simply being there is enough, or what are we really getting an award for? A sports team where everybody gets an award for having participated. And I wonder if that takes kids away from being able to do the reality principle of this is what I actually did.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
And I was on the Little League team and we didn't even make the quarterfinals. And that's just the way it is. Or, everybody just leaves 5th grade and goes on to middle school. That versus I really achieved something. I did the work. I put myself out. I was willing to enter the fray, win or lose. That it muddies that ability to really know what I have done versus other people telling me, congratulations.
Yeah.
You graduated from 5th grade.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, if we want to spend just a few more minutes, that there is some additional research that a number of researchers have extended from the initial 1978 studies and expanded it and refined it and brought it into other categories that might just be briefly interesting for us to touch on. A researcher, Dr. Valerie Young, had a very important impact, and she helped define various kinds of imposter syndromes. So she provides, I think about 5 of them: the perfectionist, the super person, the natural genius, the soloist, and the expert. And I haven't thought enough about this. Part of me is wondering if this also has to do with typology and introversion, extroversion, and the way that we dance with this compensation when we feel like we're an imposter. So the perfectionist, for whatever reason, sets excessively high goals for themselves, and that in a sense they are colluding with the part of themselves that is almost trying to prove that they are an imposter, because when they fail to reach sometimes an absurd high goal, it then self-reinforces that they didn't do as well or as well as those who really deserve to be here. So it's a very complicated, right? A complicated circular piece. And we know from a psychoanalytic standpoint that perfectionism in all its forms is a defense. That if I could only be perfect, then I would escape these consequences that I have suffered in my life. It is more driven by an attempt to evade than an attempt to achieve.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a pain vortex that's always waving at the perfectionist. So that seems something that I know I have seen a good bit of.
Yeah.
The super person, like the superwoman or the superman, they push themselves to work harder than anyone else around them. And by being the hardest working, they're proving to themselves, but also proving to the environment that they're not imposters. Because if they were skating along, then they would be somehow suspicious.
Yeah.
So the need to succeed and display labor at work, as a parent, as a spouse. And this can become such a habit that they feel panicky when they're not displaying their labor. And the labor is legitimate. I mean, they're really hammering away at all kinds of projects and often doing a remarkable job at it. But it's still a reaction to the underlying sense that I'm a fraud. So therefore I have to be supernatural. Something that I have seen in my practice, this third category, the natural genius. And these people believe that if they have to struggle or work hard to accomplish something, it also means that they are frauds. Because they're accustomed to their skills coming easily.
Yeah.
And when they actually have to put effort in, then this alarm goes off in the back of their heads. And I guess because we're analysts and maybe we appeal to other unicorns in the world, that often people that are highly creative naturally and instinctively will find their way into an analytic process. And they really do have a sense that something is wrong if it was not easy. The converse of this, which also kind of drives me crazy, is, well, you know, I thought I was going to become an analyst, but you know, every time I turned, it looked like the universe was just lined up against me, so it must not be meant to be. Because something should be easy. Because if it's easy, then it's sanctioned by the universe. And if it's sanctioned by the universe, then it must be true, and it must be true for me. and I have seen that many, many times. I used to think that it was simply a fear of struggle or a fear of failure. But I think with this idea of, do I have a legitimate right to inhabit a stance in the world? It put this other interesting spin on it. The other categorization is the soloist, and that the soloist feels that they have to accomplish their tasks only by themselves, and if they need to ask for help, that's proof that they're a fraud.
It delegitimizes things.
Delegitimizes. And so if the underlying assumption is I'm a fraud, then being the soloist again is a defense against either concluding that it's true that I'm a fraud or demonstrating that to anybody else that I'm a fraud. And the final category, which I think is also so important, is the expert. And the expert measures their competence based on what or how much they know or can know. And for them, being the know-it-all is a defense against feeling like a fraud. Because if they don't know something, then they'll be exposed as inferior. So being a perfectionist, a super person, a natural genius, a soloist, an expert are interesting ways that we find to protect ourselves from the underlying wound that I don't have a right to inhabit my own creative successes and to lay claim to them as the natural products of my own good work in the world.
Yeah, there's been a lot of interesting research on this phenomenon in recent years, and including some that I found that said that, hey, look, people who tend to feel imposter feelings are better team players. They're more interpersonally effective. And I've also seen research that indicates that the people who wind up suffering from imposter syndrome are usually exactly the people that are highly competent and accomplished. So if you're feeling these feelings, I think our recommendation to you would be to maybe label them, notice them, and then just let them go.
Yeah.
And Deb, as you've been saying, kind of keep doing work.
Yeah. And the thing I might add, we've touched on so many of the components, is, but we haven't directly addressed the fear of failure. And I think it was implicit in, a lot of the personal examples that we gave. But there is the how we attribute meaning to failure, that, I interviewed for this position and I didn't get it. I wasn't admitted to the program. Or, the person stormed out of my office and said this was a ridiculous kind of session, or whatever it is. That if we attribute that to, oh my gosh, I was inadequate, I just didn't have the right stuff, that is a false attribution of, I might not have been prepared. I might not have known enough. It might have been a difficult situation. There are 100 things. But what can you learn from that? And a wise person said that to me years ago. It's like, he said, what have you learned from that? And it was like a little light went off. It was sort of like, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. Well, I think what I learned was that I went into it with my lights blazing and my hopes held high and various other things. And what I've learned is maybe to settle down a little more. Maybe I needed to have prepared a little differently. But it reframed the whole thing of that's all it was. I needed to learn something that I didn't know, and now I can learn it. Failure is a part of life. Of course it is. And it does not define us at all. And I think we've touched on so many of these things that we can talk to ourselves about and be real.
Mm-hmm. Before Joseph reads today's dream, I just want to remind everyone about Dream School. So Jung said that one of the points of analysis was to teach people how to work with their own dreams. It is hard to work with your own dreams. It's hard for me to work with my dreams, but there are tools that you can learn that can help you approach your dreams from a symbolic standpoint and really take aboard their wisdom. The process of self-change gets speeded up when we do dream work. Dreams are beautiful and inspiring, but more than anything, they really do help us change and grow into the person that we were meant to be. So we invite you to join Dream School. It's a 12-month online program that you do at your own pace. There are, recorded lectures. There are written materials. There's suggested readings. There's a really great community. There are dream groups. There's the Dreamatorium, and there are live events every month with me, Deb, and Joseph. So you get to kind of be with us intimately and learn to work with your dreams. So check out our website, thisjungianlife.com, and you'll see a button right there to check out Dream School.
So today, we're going to read the dream of a 17-year-old male who submitted his dream through our website. He works at a mobile vehicle washing business, and he titles his dream, "My Ex-Girlfriend Texting Another Ex-Girlfriend." And here's his dream. I'm sitting on the benches around the top middle row at a high school football game. People were around, but it was not crowded, so I had a good view. I was standing next to my ex-friend, a girl. She and I had sort of a relationship about 10 or 11 months ago. It didn't work out, and we don't talk anymore. She was standing near me on my right, one row below, so I was a couple of inches above her. In a group chat, she was texting something about her friends, and I saw my other ex-girlfriend on her phone. All I saw was her social media profile. I was feeling confused and shocked. Why was my ex-friend in a group chat with my other ex? They're two completely different people and go to different schools. Then I fell back asleep. Mm-hmm. I'm now on the ground floor beside the tall benches. In my peripheral vision, I see the football players come out. They were all running to the field like any normal football game, but I was running beside them on the left, going in the opposite direction. They're going to the field, and I'm heading toward the school, holding an energy drink. Then I had flashbacks of running on the benches themselves. And he gives us a bit more significant information. I recently went to a juvenile detention center where I was reminiscing about my ex-friends and the females that I loved and used to talk to. I came home last night around midnight and had this dream. When I woke up at about 10 or 11 a.m. The main feelings in the dream were confusion, feeling shocked, and surprised. And he gives us a little bit of extra information. The school is the one I go to, not currently in school till next month. The two females were two people I had true feelings for and a deep connection at the same time about 1.5 years ago. I didn't stop talking to the one that I said was right next to me in my dream till about 10 months ago or so. She goes to a different school. The other on the phone in the group chat goes to the same school as me.
Well, I'll just maybe start off by saying how touched I was when I saw this in our pile this morning. And I think that it really shows, dreams are for everyone. This is a very young person submitting a dream, but dreams are there to guide us, and they come in the interest of healing and wholeness, no matter where we are in life. And maybe I'll just start by saying it's interesting because this dream sort of has these two major parts to it. One is up in the bleachers, and the other is, I think, down on the field as I read it. And there's the realm of the feminine, maybe up in the bleachers, and then the realm of the masculine down on the field. So maybe I'll just pass the baton there for now.
Well, the thing that strikes me is that there are two anima figures, and there's some investment that the dream ego has in keeping them separate. It's one in one school, one in the other school. Both of these people are interesting to the dream ego. He's had, perhaps wants to have, relationships with both of them, but there's a secretive quality to it. There's some concern that if all of this were to come together, that somehow that would be frightening, confusing, shocking. So it's not uncommon, I think, for young men particularly, to have different versions of the anima because they're still experimenting with what fits them, what makes sense to them, what's a right kind of person to spend time with. But Jung said over time, the various versions of the anima need to come together into a singular figure. Now, if we think about the anima as the image of a part of the young man that would complete him in some way, that would help him actualize aspects of his personality which at this point are unconscious, it's reasonable to think, for all of us when we're quite young, that there's a lot of qualities that we don't know about ourselves yet. There's a lot of features and feelings and capacities that are in the unconscious. And so it makes sense that there might be different ways of conceptualizing it. But when that plays out in the social sphere, it feels like we're chasing down all kinds of different people in order to have different aspects of the experience. And that, of course, can be very stressful and confusing.
Jung had a split anima, which he attributed to the fact that, his mother was one person, and then he had this female caregiver who was very different from his mother and had a real impact on him. So there were these kind of two templates for what the feminine should look like in his life. If we had this dreamer here, I'd be really interested to know, who are these two girls? How are they similar? How are they different? He has strong feelings for both of them, but it is Joseph, to your point, is really interesting that they're both there, and he seems very shocked that somehow they know each other. This is deeply unsettling to
Yeah.
him. So it's almost like something in the unconscious
Mhm.
wants to integrate, but that feels a little threatening.
Yeah. What I'm aware of in both of these dreams or parts of the same dream is that the dream ego is distant from and separate from the other dream figures. So the first part of the dream, he's up in probably the bleachers, and the two ex-girlfriends know each other and are texting each other to his surprise. Then he's down on the field where the game is played, but he is not part of the football team. He's running in the other direction. The players are coming out, and he's going in the opposite direction, holding an energy drink. So I'm wondering if there is something here with our dream ego of feeling separate, feeling distant, and trying to energize himself while being with but not part of what's happening with the other dream figures. There's a way that he doesn't belong.
It's interesting to me that there's we could imagine there's kind of a when then is sort of when he realizes the two ex-girlfriends know each other, then he's down on the field. I mean, I am really curious about the scene on the field, because that would seem to me to possibly be a positive development. He's no longer just observing, he's down on the field. But of course, as I read it, he's running in the opposite direction.
Yes,
he's running
exactly.
back toward the school.
He's retreating from the field, or from where the action or conflict might be.
I often, it's funny, this dream comes up because I have an image that I use a lot, which is the difference between an objective and a subjective experience. And I liken it to the difference between being up in the skybox at a football game, or we could say on the bleachers. You're observing and you're looking down at the field where you can see it all, versus being on the field and being, one of the players, and that's your subjective experience. And it's not that one point of view is better than the other. They're both valid. But here it seems that neither viewpoint is working well for the dream ego. When he's up on the bleachers, the two ex-girlfriends are communicating, but he is not communicating with them. And when he's down on the field, where one might expect he would be in the game somehow, or part of at least running in the same direction, instead he's running in another direction. He's going in the opposite way. So neither the objective nor the subjective viewpoint seems to be yielding a feeling of connection.
Well, I would also say that for someone at this age, right, he's 17 years old, in some sense, especially for young men, the task of life is to get onto the field.
Right.
And so it does seem
Yes.
like there is something positive about him being on the field. And maybe the energy drink is also a positive symbol. Like you said, Deb, he's kind of trying to energize. But he's running the wrong way. And I would, if I had him here, I'd say, well, where do you think you're running the wrong way in your life?
Yeah.
He's also, at the moment where he submitted this, I think in a juvenile detention center. And when people are sent off the field, there's a sense that, they've been extracted from the game. So I think that part of the psyche is also symbolizing and trying to process being taken out of the social environment, out of the natural high school ethos and being set aside and detained, ostensibly for some kind of a conflict, some kind of a problem.
I am wondering about the personal comment that he shares of, I recently went to juvenile detention center and came home last night around midnight. Was he visiting? Was he detained there? Juvenile detention centers are for young people who have been deemed fairly or unfairly not abiding by overall societal norms.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if this has some reflection in the dream of not connecting with the two ex-girlfriends and not going in the same direction as the football players running onto the field to get into the game. And we would say into the game of life as a dream image.
And yes, and I also want to say, I was really moved that the dreamer said that he had deep feelings for both of these girls. And here is a 17-year-old writing down his dreams.
Aww.
So, this is a soulful person who maybe is running the wrong way. But there is that potential for connection, that potential for the connection with himself, which is symbolized in part by being, you're right, Deb, he's not in relationship in the dream with these two women, but he's close by. And again, there's this mysterious integration happen because these two anima figures are kind of in secret identity with one another.
Yes.
And then that helps him get onto the field, maybe. But it's not quite the right thing. But there is, you can really see the actions of the self in this dream, I think. And also, in spite of the fact that it seems like just a little dream, and in some sense has these kind of quotidian imagery, it's really very archetypal, because we have this kind of the realm of the gladiatorial conflict with the football field, and the kind of pining for the relationship with the anima. I mean, it calls to mind the courtly love images where knight errants would, wear the token of their loved one as they went into battle or they went to joust. So the connection with the anima being the precursor to taking on the manly role and getting in the field, getting on the field. So there's a lot there.
I also think there's something interesting in the beginning of the setting. And again, this may have something to do with the containment in the detention center, because it makes our world smaller. It gives us time to think about the circumstances we're in. So the dream opens, and the dream maker puts him in a position where he can silently observe the secret life of the anima and gain information about the way the anima creates relationships, because the anima is the connecting force. And even in the symbol of having the phone and the group chat, and even chats beyond what he might have imagined, it's displaying its relational power. And the male ego is just given this little secret glimpse from a little bit above and to the side and a few inches down. And part of the revelation is, that's what's going on here. Behind my back, I had no idea that the unconscious is communicating out through the ethers. It's through these fantastical cell signals. Messages are flying through the air, and parts of himself or parts of his life are in this dance of communication, which he just was shocked to understand that. So I think as you were leaning into, it's a bit of an initiation, as small and perhaps as conventional as the symbols are, they still carry all of those valences.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's going to take some time for him to realize, I don't live in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's so much interrelatedness throughout his psyche and throughout his social environment.
And of course, we don't know much about what's happening on the field. I'd be so curious to know if this kid played football. We don't know much about the feeling on the scene on the field. So I'm sort of reading into it, voluminously. But again, I'm just struck by the image of the sort of the field of battle, as it were. And I would like to just read a little bit from the famous Roosevelt speech, which is sometimes known as The Man in the Arena. And he says in this speech, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." So in my imagination, I'm cheering this dreamer on as he tries to get into the arena. And I'm really curious about the fact that he's running the wrong way, and would invite him to reflect on that.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show, and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.